Thank you, and welcome everyone to this talk. I know, good afternoon from London, but I know people are viewing from all over the place. Today's speaker is Arka Chakraborty, who's a PhD student at SOAS in London. He's currently in Bengal on fieldwork for today, his PhD obviously, and as indicated in the notes, he's been throughout Bengal, East India and Bangladesh, researching mostly the topic of today's talk, which is Dylan consciousness within Bānglā-gān since the 60s. He's going to tell us, give a presentation, and then we will open up to questions and answers. I'm pretty sure there are a lot more specialists tuning in right now. I'm very much a layperson when it comes to either subject, whether it's Bānglā-gān or Dylan. I'm not a Dylanologist, but I am familiar with, I guess, the inverse of the title, which is Dylan being consciousness of Bānglā-gān, or at least the Bāul tradition in Bangla music, because when he was a famous folk musician in the late 60s, 1967, one of his albums, John Wesley Harding, has a famous picture as the album cover of himself with the two musicians who are highlighted in the blurb for today's talk, Purna and Laxman. They were living with him in upstate New York in 1967, and they're on that album cover. And he and his manager did a lot of work with them, sharing, as it were, a common empathy because they represented folk traditions in their respective cultures. So I'm coming to this sort of really fresh to learn, really. So I'm going to hand over to Arka in a minute. But I would have thought in the last 6 years, whatever it is that attracted Dylan to take an interest in Bāuls, and people close associates of him like Allen Ginsberg, the poet, probably goes back a couple hundred years. It goes back to Laxman, and it's the same things that attract musicians of all types of musical styles to the traditional Bāul music in Bānglā-gān. But so I'd be very interested to hear what the research is bringing up, and I'm going to invite Arka to just give the presentation, and then we'll open it to questions afterwards. Please unmute. Unmute.
Sorry, once again, I'm sorry. Many thanks, Dr. Alu, for the introduction, and of course, an enormous thank you to Dr. Ahmedullah for this opportunity, to be here. I've heard many great things about Brick Lane, especially from my supervisor at SOAS, Dr. Richard Williams, who recently also gave a talk. And I've been looking forward to this session now for a long time. But before I begin, I would like to wish everyone a happy Durga Puja. Festivities have begun, and today is Panchami, so Shubho Panchami to all of you. I'd like to share my PowerPoint now.
Can you speak up a bit? It's a bit low.
Am I audible now?
A little bit better, yeah.
Thank you. How do I share you? You have to enable the screen sharing.
Oh, I'm registered. I have to make you co-host. Then you can do it.
Basically, yeah.
Yes, I have made you co-host, yeah.
Thank you. There you go. I'm also going to share my sound. And okay, now. So this picture, as you can see, is of a beautiful graffiti art of the American singer-songwriter Bob Dylan on Purna Road, Hindustan Park in Kolkata. An interlocutor and a friend who's especially proven to be crucially helpful to my fieldwork in the last months, donated this artwork in 2019, and this I feel is really indicative of Dylan's professionality within the Bengali cultural memory. Since the inception of his music career in the early 60s, Dylan's music has influenced music cultures all over the world. In West Bengal, Many Dylan songs have been translated and adapted by urban Bengali musicians over the decades. It is also important to mention here that although Dylan appears among an assembly of Anglo-American and transnational influences on Bengali music culture, for this talk I'm only focusing on Dylan and his representation within the Bengali musical repertoire since the 1960s. So I'll try to explore Bānglā-gān, Bengali music in West Bengal through a Dylanian lens and try to trace out how Dylan and his music have permeated within the Bengali cultural fabric. The immediate question that arises is why the Dylanian lens? Now, this is because one, as we shall see throughout the course of this presentation, Dylan is a reference point constantly used to identify a number of contemporary urban musicians who have adopted the Dylanesque styles of music. Number two, contemporary Indian popular music is a consequence of cultural globalization, and hence it makes sense to talk about the Anglo-American and transnational influences in the production of local music. And number three, because the dialogue between Bob Dylan and regional music taps into the issues regarding Bengali culture. Now, there are two concepts by Israeli scholar Moti Rijef that have particularly informed my research up until this point. The umbrella term rock aesthetic as the canonization of the classic Anglo-American rock albums and artists of the 1960s and 70s, and the phenomenon of pop rockization caused by interactions between this global rock aesthetic and the local music cultures. I view the resulting pop rockized urban music forms as local music, borrowing Habibul Haq Kodkar's concept of musical glocalization. I argue that the regional and urban Bengali music is in a sense local music whereby the global Anglo-American influences, or in this context, Dylanian influences, interact with the local musical traditions to transform the Bengali song tradition. The careful observations identify a Dylan-centric discourse operational across multiple creative music genres in Eastern India. This discourse has been enforced by the expanding Dylan consciousness among Indian audiences and the media obsessions of drawing parallels with globally recognized artists. In West Bengal, we have the Bāul musician Purna Bāul and the modern Bengali singer-songwriter Kobir Suman, who have been dubbed as Indianized versions of Dylan. Folk musician Ruben Mashangwa from Manipur has also been credited with the reviving the Tangkhul Naga music tradition of Nagaland, has also drawn similar comparisons with Dylan. Meghalayan musician Lou Major, popularly recognized for organizing the annual Bob Dylan Music Festival in Shillong, is however a notable exception to this trend as his entire musical personality is dedicated in tribute to the American singer-songwriter. What we thus mark is the quintessential Dylanness in the musical styles of these artists. The cultural reception of Dylan within these music scenes is thus a metonym for a much larger pattern of cross-cultural Indo-Western musical exchanges. The first Dylan song to be effectively translated and refashioned into a Bengali song was Blowing in the Wind, composed during the early years of Dylan's career in his album The Freewheeling Bob Dylan in 1963. This song is mostly remembered as a protest song and poses a series of rhetorical questions about peace, war, and freedom. I will now play the original Dylan score, followed by the Bengali version, to try to conduct a comparative analysis of the two musical pieces. I am playing the Dylan version, the original version of the song.
বলো আর কত পথ হাঁটবে মানুষ তবে সে মানুষ হবে বলো আর কত দূর উড়লে কপট শান্তিতে ঘুমিয়ে রবে বলো আর কতবার গর্জে কামান নীরব সে হয়ে যাবে বইছে জবাব বাতাসে বন্ধু বইছে জবাব আকাশে.
Okay, so basically the refrain, the answer, my friend, is blowing in the wind, has been described as impenetrably ambiguous. Either the answer is so obvious that it is right in your face, or the answer is that as intangible as the wind. Although Dylan has throughout his career categorically refuted that this song is a protest song, Blowing the Wind effectively earned him the label of a protest musician among the American audiences, one that he is still associated with after almost 6 decades. I was going to play the Bengali version of the song, but as the music cannot be played, I'll just talk about it. This Bengali translation, sung by Purnadas Bāul and his wife Manju Das, effectively begins a dialogue between the Indian and American folk music traditions. However, the Bengali and Baul aesthetics are not refuted, rather highlighted within this musical score. The acoustic guitar and harmonica accompanying Dylan's original version are replaced with the Indian instruments like harmonium and tabla. The Western 4/4 beat is appropriated into the kaharwa, or the Indian 8-metered rhythm cycle. The lyrics are almost entirely identical, and hence this song may also be considered to be a cover version of the original track. This further validates the argument of a Dylan-centric discourse being operational across creative Bengali musical genres. It is 1962 and the beat poet Allen Ginsberg is in Kolkata with his partner Peter Orlovsky exploring the Bengali cultural landscape. In their travels, they cross paths with four anti-establishment Bengali poets known as the Hungryalist Quartet, which leads to inspired creative and literary exchanges. One of these Hungry Generation poets, Shakti Chattopadhyay, introduces them to the Bauls and Fakirs of Bengal. Ginsberg's travels take him to Birbhum, where Chattopadhyay introduces him to Navani Khapa Baul, an ailing and paralyzed old man virtually on his deathbed. Navani said of Ginsberg and Orlovsky, "They are born Bauls, they will spread the Baul message, and true peace, friendship and dharma, righteousness, will arrive." This meeting initiated a chain of events that transformed the Bengali cultural world, and inspired Ginsberg returns to the United States and composes the poem After Lalun, effectively upholding Navani prophecy and turning the American gaze towards these mad men from rural Bengal. Fast forward to 1967, and Albert Grossman, the manager of Bob Dylan, is at the Oberoi Grand in Kolkata. Grossman is the manager of most of the Woodstock-based American folk musicians, including Dylan, Joan Baez, and Pete Seeger, to name a few. Ginsberg's vibrant tales of the Bāuls of Bengal prompt him to travel to Kolkata and meet up with Navani sons, Purna and Laxman Baul. A short Bānglā-gān performance assisted by the Ektara and the Khamak was enough to persuade Grossman to bring the Das brothers and their entourage to the United States. The Bauls traveled to the USA for the first time and played concerts in San Francisco, Los Angeles, and Santa Cruz, after which they were invited up to Beersville. Based in Woodstock and managed by Grossman, the Das brothers would eventually go on to spread the Baul ethos within the American cultural world. Their travels to the United States also paved the way for Dylan's only correspondence with Indian music culture. The Das brothers and Dylan would perform together multiple times, once in 1967, once in 1973 in Madison Square Garden, and then in 1984 alongside Mick Jagger. Dylan's collaboration with the Bāuls of Bengal was transformative for the global reception of Baul music and also has had long-lasting consequences on Indian popular music scenes. The Das brothers also appeared on the cover of Dylan's album John Wesley Harding, which is now considered an epochal event in popularizing Bāuls-gān, Baul music, in the West. The Bauls, commonly viewed as a Bengali national symbol, were historically rural minstrels wandering across the green pastures of rural Bengal, spreading voices of freedom and brotherhood. The unique philosophy and lifestyle of these rural people influenced countless urban musicians and scholars over the centuries, most notably the Nobel laureate Rabindranath Tagore. The cultural roots of the Baul tradition circle back to Lalan Shah Fakir's philosophy of humanism. Lalan Shah was one of the earliest pioneers of the Baul Fakir tradition, a syncretistic combination of the Hindu and Islamic indigenous traditions of 19th century Bengal. Lalon embodies the spirit of the subcontinental concepts of bhakti and Sufism, and a vast array of songs of the Bāuls of Bengal incorporate Lalon and his philosophy as a central discourse. Historically, the Bāuls were poor people wandering across the green pastures of Bengal spreading voices of freedom and brotherhood. In an early 20th century context, they symbolized the Ashikhito Akritim Hriday, the uneducated authentic heart of Bengal, and specifically the languages and oral traditions of the villages. Baul sadhana or Baul religious practices were based predominantly on self-realization, neglecting exterior ritualism such as icon worship. Complex tantric yogic practices, often of a sexual nature, were also an essential feature of Baul religious practice. Purnadas Baul's success in the West left an indelible imprint on Baulism, effectively modernizing their culture. The success of the Das brothers in the United States is marked by two albums, Bāuls of Bengal and Bengali Bāuls at Big Pink, both principal collections inviting the Western world into the ethos of Bānglā-gān. These albums are now considered as cultural timepieces that were heard by Dylan and other contemporary Western musicians like Mick Jagger from the Rolling Stones. The latter album, Bengali Bāuls at Big Pink, was produced by Gareth Hudson of the band, who were fellow performers with Dylan. Levin Hume of the band chronicles the production of Bengali Bāuls at Big Pink. The Bāuls wanted to jam, Gareth wanted to record. So we moved the cushions from the living room sofa downstairs, and the Bāuls sat in a circle so that they could hear one another and begin to play the Indian soul theme. A minute later, they were already wailing in their own language, in their own world. Charles and I looked at one another and thought, no way. So we got up and let the Bāuls play. Hours later, Gareth's tape machine was still rolling. These tapes were released years later as Bengali Bāuls and Big Pink. Purnadas Baul is also credited with the birth of the American Bāuls in the home community in Prescott, Arizona, effectively starting a dialogue between the Baul tradition and the Western world. Purnadas is a mentor to the home community, and several of these community musicians have performed on tour with him, and the relationship was described to be one of mutual regard and shared creativity. Recognized today as the representative of Baul culture on the global stage, Purnadas in 2001 established the Purnadas Baul Academy in San Diego, California, to teach ancient Indian Baul music and philosophy. The term Baul comes from the Sanskrit word Vatula or Batula, meaning affected by the wind disease. The concept of Batula is central to understanding Baul identity. This concept is characterized by a critique of religious orthodoxy, deconstructing ideas of caste and social status, and questioning the values of material wealth. Often used to describe the Baul ethos of dissidence, eccentricism, and nonconformism, Batula has been a key concept in modern Bengali music since the 70s. The essence of Batula in Baul music played a role in evoking narratives of counterculture and dissidence within Bengali popular music. This ethos, of course, resonates with the countercultural narratives within American folk songs, one notable example being Dylan's Blowing in the Wind. The concept of Batula played a key role in evoking the countercultural narratives within modern Bengali music. Dylan unwittingly has a context that fits within this characteristic of Baulism. When Dylan sings, "The answer, my friend, is blowing in the wind," he essentially translates the ethos of Batula into the paradigm of an American folk song. Dylan's claims of being the American Baul again enables a rereading of his musical personality in the context of Baul philosophy. In 2013, Purnadas recorded a tribute version of Dylan's Tambourine Man from the album From Another World, a tribute to Bob Dylan, commemorating his friendship with the American musician. From Another World, a tribute to Dylan, reaffirms the possibilities of analyzing Dylan and his music from the ethnomusicological perspective, which must be delightful news to all eminent Dylan scholars. The album art incorporates images of indigenous people walking, and even a woman holding a cello-esque instrument sat at the back of a horse-driven carriage. The album comprises of 13 tracks composed by musicians from different countries like Iran, Bhutan, Algeria, Egypt, and of course, India. The tracks may best be described as radically reimagined versions of different Dylan songs, where the artists have incorporated their native instruments and languages in representing Dylan as they have perceived best. Uh, I can try to play the music again, but I'm going to move on. Uh, the original version of the song by Dylan, Tambourine Man, evokes the themes of urban existentialism and nostalgia, while Purnadas's songs appropriate the score into a celebration of humanity and brotherhood. Purnadas's tribute version translates Dylan's original score into a celebration of Baul, the Batula blown by the wind identity. The Anglo-Saxon percussion instrument tambourine is replaced by Purnadas with a conjun, an essential Baul hand percussion instrument from rural Bengal. However, in contrast with Purnadas's version of Blowing in the Wind, this song is not a direct translation of Dylan's original score. Rather, it is an adaptation. The song also becomes a tribute piece to acknowledge his contributions in globalizing Baul music, as Purna mentions how the wheels of fortune have blessed him to travel across the sea and spread the message of love and humanity. This Dylanesque Bānglā-gān is again not merely a lyrical or musical translation, it is rather representative of a much larger pattern of the localization of imported styles within the Bengali popular song tradition. Modern Bengali music styles exhibit an intercultural confluence between the global Dylanesque and the local Baul styles, and have changed dramatically over the years due to globalization and the cosmopolitan tastes of an increasingly urbanized audience. The stereotypical image of an authentic poor rural Baul is no longer representative. Following Purnadas's model, many Baul singers started exploiting their saleability as entertainment for the urban elite and realized that local identities and distinctiveness can provide the basis for tourist products. The modern Shilpi Baul stands in contrast with the rural and local aesthetic minstrel bowls. The Shilpi Bowls are cosmopolitan performers and use Western instruments like the guitar, drumming kits, octopad, and keyboard in making modern folk fusion music. In a contemporary urban Bengali setting, most Baul musicians perform Baul Gan but do not subscribe to the tantric yogic Baul practices. In the music of contemporary urban Baul rock bands like the Bolpur Blues led by Kartik Das Baul, similar fusion music styles can be observed. However, they were not the first to experiment with Baul Gan. A band of young friends assembled by Gautam Chattopadhyay initiated an experiment in syncretic music in 1975. The band Mohinir Ghodaguli, literally meaning Mohin's horses, produced music drawing inspiration from a variety of genres, but preferred the label Baul Jazz. Once again, the Baul Jazz genre entails a combination of the global and the local, bringing together heritage folk music of Bengal with the globally popular American folk music style. Without their cosmopolitan approaches, experimental genres like Baul fusion would cease to exist. The music produced by this Baul jazz group also exhibits the Batula ethos of social criticism and political protest. Led by Chattopadhyay, they were among the Bengali youth of the 70s who were also directly involved in the Naxalite movement against the then government of West Bengal. Now remembered as the first Bengali rock music band, Mohinar Ghodaguli effectively initiated the culture of music bands within the Bengali and by extension Indian popular song tradition. The band lineup featured, among others, Gautam Chattopadhyay, or popularly referred to as Monida, on vocals and Taposh Das on the electric guitar. The members of the band were an integral part of the urban educated youth of the 70s who studied at the then Presidency College, now Presidency University in Calcutta, and were all well versed in Marxist philosophy. The global Anglo-American influences of the likes of Dylan or the Beatles was ever present within their cultural and musical repertoire, and their experimental musical trends dwelled on the themes of politics, revolution, injustice, and other themes of ordinary life, and were also heavily influenced by the American urban folk movement of the 60s led by Dylan, the poster boy of the American folk community. At the heart of the band's revolutionary and bohemian nature was the vehement wish to break free from prejudices, stereotypes, and established social structures. The position as a symbol of modernity is indicative again from the band's name, which is borrowed from eminent Bengali poet Jibanananda Das's poem Ghoda, meaning horse. মহিনের ঘোড়াগুলো ঘাস খায় কার্তিকের জ্যোৎস্নার প্রান্তরে. Mahim's horses graze on the horizon in the autumn moonlight. However, the identity of this band was often misconstrued as hippies in the eyes of the orthodox and suburban mainstream Bengali audiences, who at the time were not progressive enough to understand or acknowledge their experimentation and unique sounds. This is because, again, the mainstream Bengali ear at the time was attuned only to the tradition of the modern Bengali songs, Adhunik Bānglā-gān, dating back to the seminal oeuvre of Rabindranath Tagore and its romantic themes. It is pertinent to mention that the band was formed in against the backdrop of the socio-political tensions in Bengal at the time, especially with the Naxalite movement and the clashes of the educated youth with the government, which invariably draw inspiration from the American countercultural movement happening at the same time in another part of the world. The decade of the 60s and the 70s ushered in an era of turbulence, riots, and socio-political tensions. The Naxalbari uprising was an armed peasant revolt in 1967 in the Naxalbari bloc in Darjeeling, West Bengal. The peasants of Naxalbari, who mainly worked on tea plantations and at large estates, had for centuries been exploited by the landowning classes and the moneylenders. On March 25, 1967, when one of the sharecroppers in the village tried to till the land from which he had been illegally evicted, the landlord got him brutally beaten up and took away his belongings. Exasperated by the exploitation of the landlords, peasants across the village got together and rose in rebellion. It was mainly led by tribals and the radical communist leaders of Bengal. The event became an inspiration to the Naxalite movement, which radically spread from West Bengal to other states of India. In the immediate aftermath of the uprising, the urban youth of India, several among them being from the privileged sections of society, were remarkably inspired to rise in revolution. Descendants of a generation that had seen independence, for those in their 20s in the 60s and 70s, Naxalbari was their moment of bringing change in the way in which their parents' generations had risen against the colonial state. It was not uncommon to see posters of Naxalbari hanging across the walls of colleges in Calcutta. Many students left colleges to join the Naxalites. The relentless struggle between the armed Naxalites and the police would lead to the death of countless urban Bengali youth. Police brutalities were also no exception, with many Naxalite sympathizers being subjected to witch hunts and subsequent encounter killings. Among the urban youth who joined in arms with the Naxalites were Gautam Chattopadhyay and Taposh Das. Gautam Chattopadhyay was imprisoned and sentenced to imprisonment in Alipur Central Jail from 1971 to 1972. He would silently suffer the tortures of taunts in jail and wrote songs about a reality centered around failure and hopelessness. He was taunted by the inmates for his long hair, his presidency college background, his fluency in English, and his love for Ingreji Gan, English songs, citing them as signs of his privileged and sophisticated upbringing. In the songs of Mohiner Ghodaguli, a political context is thus ever present, alongside lamentations of a failed revolution. This is again a video of a live performance by contemporary Bengali urban musician Arka Mukherjee, who was performing this song by Mohinder Ghodaguli. For now, we'll have to just take at it with the lyrics. So this song is one of the earliest examples again of Bengali fusion music, and the lyric heralds an assembly of global influences on Bengali culture, including Dylan. On the surface, the song appears to be a celebration of the Bengali Bhadralok or bourgeoisie high culture. However, this song was also composed in the midst of political turmoil. The song, composed by Taposh Das in the early 70s when he fled to Goshaba in the Sundarbans along with Gautam Chattopadhyay. They survived for 2 days on flour soaked in water. They were treated like VIPs as they came from Kolkata, and they were given a chili to go with it, which was a luxury in those circumstances. However, Gautam contracted high fever on the way to returning Kolkata via a small boat across the river Ganges. In the midst of all of this, Taposh Das thought of the song Bhalo Lage. Their music stands again in contrast with the romantic period of Bengali music of the 50s and 60s, where the semi-classical repertoire of the likes of Hemanta Mukherjee and Manna De dwelled on the themes of love and romance. Taposh Das, in an interview, answered this question when he commented, "Yes, we steered clear of that kind of stuff. It was a conscious decision not to use the kind of language being used in mainstream songs and poetry, to extol the virtues of spring on Neel Akash, blue sky, and express love for one's beloved. We could never ignore social realities, and it was this consciousness that reflected in our music." Adhunik Bānglā-gān, much like Bāul-gān, has been appropriated to meet the demands of urbanity. The experimental styles of Mohinir Ghodaguli was carried forward in the 1990s by a generation of musicians now recognized under the label Jivanmukhi or reality or life-oriented. This generation, featuring Kobi Suman, Nuchiketa Chakraborty, Moshimi Bhomik, and Anjan Dotto, sparked a lyrical revolution within Adhunik Bangla by focusing on socio-political and socio-cultural issues. Suman, the so-called Bengali Dylan, translated four Dylan songs: "Blowing in the Wind," "Tambourine Man," "Farewell Angelina," and "All I Really Want to Do" over the 90s. The rise of communism in post-colonial Bengal also impacted the personalities of this generation of musicians. Their music exhibits a socio-political awareness which resonates with the countercultural ethos of Batula. Schumann shattered the traditional notion of the singer as a benign social entertainer and revealed himself to be a scathing social critic, an intellectual who spoke and argued well. At the heart of the Jivanmukhi philosophy was thus, again, an anti-establishment agenda focusing on the social and political realities of life in Kolkata. From the Jivanmukhi generation, Kobi Suman, formerly Suman Chatterjee, is an important musical personality again who imported Anglo-American musical influences within the Bengali song tradition. Shuman's autobiography, Hoye Otha Gan, How Music Happened, is in particular an important text recollecting how Bengali music has transformed over the ages. Here, Shuman recalls the first time he listened to Dylan's A Hard Rain's Gonna Fall during his trip to a friend's place in France in 1973. The lyrics, music, and the emotions are said to have tore through him. He realized how Dylan had incorporated the naked realities of urban ordinary life into his songs, which again inspired him to compose Bengali songs of a similar shared philosophy. In 1997, the French newspaper Libération addressed Bengali singer-songwriter Suman as the Bengali Bob Dylan. However, Suman in 2016 himself remarked, "Dylan was never my guru," distancing himself from these comparisons while at the same time acknowledging the Dylanian influences on his music in the same reportage. Dylan's simplicity, in fact, sent me back to my folk roots. Schumann's account is indicative of a diverse lineage of pop musicians in eastern India subscribing to Dylan's musicality. It is also important to note that Schumann trained in playing Western instruments during his time as a journalist in the USA and West Germany. Schumann picked up on the acoustic guitar in Germany and tried his hand at electronic music in the United States. Schumann also tried to get in touch with Dylan, as mentioned in his autobiography, in hopes of interviewing him, which unfortunately never really materialized. However, Schumann developed a friendship with American folk musician Pete Seeger, and even performed alongside him in Nazrul Mancha in Kolkata during Seeger's visit to Kolkata in 1999. I also had a recording of Shuman playing live in Kolkata, but I'll just share the link later. So this recording is again of Shuman's performance combining Dylan's Farewell Angelina and the adapted Bengali version Bidai Porichita, Farewell Beloved. Shuman's comments during this performance are quite interesting too. Shuman remarks of the influences on his music from Tagore to Lalan Fakir to Dylan. This is once again indicative of the connected global and local influences that have modernized the Bengali song tradition. Shuman, in essence, thus becomes a cultural translator, contributing to the localization of the Bengali song tradition. Bob Dylan's reception within the Bengali song tradition can be traced back to the rich musical and lyrical traditions of Tagore and Lalan Fakir. Dylan is the second singer-songwriter to be awarded the Nobel Prize in Literature, with the first being Rabindranath Tagore in 1930, almost 100 years back, for his book of poems Gitanjali. This might also be considered as one reason, it might be argued, for such great receptivity of Dylan's music within Bengali culture. In Dylan's translations and adaptations in Bengali music, we find a celebration of cultural identities across nations and cultures. A form of regional uniqueness may also be noted in Bengali culture. Historically, the Bengali cultural landscape was transformed during colonial times through a period remembered as the Bengali Renaissance. Associated with major intellectuals, including most famously Ram Mohan Roy and Rabindranath Tagore. Under British rule, the Bengali intelligentsia and new reformist movements like the Brahmo Samaj borrowed elements from their colonizers and appropriated them within their own cultural realm. The rise of America as the culturally dominant force since the 1960s again saw Western cultural elements being drawn into Bengali culture. Now, culturalism in Bengal has always demonstrated a relationship between its regionally exceptional and the globally dominant order. The local specificity and the rich indigenous tradition, the Bengaliness, is never uprooted. What we instead see is a celebration of the hybrid articulation of unique and creative cultural products. The Bengaliness and the Mark Dylanness do not negate each other, rather they converge to refashion cultural identities. This regional exceptionalism thus converses with the Mark Dylanness to refashion musical identities through musical and by extension cultural translation. I'm going to end with the references. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Arka, and thank you for everyone who's chipped in with suggestions on the technical difficulties. I think everyone appreciates.
Yeah, I can only apologize because half of the effect of the talk was in the music, playing the music at the right time. So, yeah.
But no, I think you cover so many different issues like the national rights and these quite a long sweep of history from the 60s to the 90s. So I think there's a lot of food for thought. And as we said, that if you circulate or send Amadullah a list of the YouTube links, I think people will be very curious to follow up.
Yeah.
If you number them properly in relation to the section, then I can insert, when I edit and make the final video, I can insert those music.
Sure, I can. I think I should then email you later after the end of this discussion. Yeah.
Okay, that's really helpful. No, it's a very interesting talk. I think if people want to put their hands up or type out a question, feel free. Otherwise, I'll kick things off. I think I'm still, if somebody was a newcomer to any form of sort of music in Bangladesh, for example, that was influenced by Bāuls or followed the Bāul tradition, they might hear a lot of Western influences, but they wouldn't necessarily hear Bob Dylan.
Yeah.
So I'm still a little bit skeptical about how much he transformed music. I think rather than he was certainly influenced by the Bāul tradition and philosophies, the universal things of universal brotherhood, all you need is love, all those things, they can go back much beyond the 60s, although the 60s saw a revival, global interest in those types of philosophy, and he was certainly a part of that. But when I hear sort of like contemporary sort of songs in Bangladesh or see festivals, I see people influenced by blues and a lot of Western traditions. But they wouldn't necessarily think of Dylan, because they think when people think of Dylan, they think of the lyrics that he writes, which are very specific to him. So that would be my thought. We do have a question coming through. Oh no, sorry, it's just another comment.
There's a question. There's a question.
Is there a question?
Deb.
Yeah.
Thank you, Mike. Yeah.
Okay. Shall I?
Yes, please. No.
I think it's a very interesting topic, and it kind of brings out the kind of resistance among communities in terms of how music is understood in the context of the subcontinent, not necessarily in terms of our classical music, which has been there for a long time, but there are other alternative kind of forms of music. But to consider it as folk music, I would suggest that to reconsider that term. Because if you look at the 1960s and 70s, when this whole idea of little and great tradition emerged within sociological thinking in India, with the emergence of village studies and the kind of influence of American anthropology into South Asian studies and the kind of de-scaling of the British anthropological tradition, we saw this growing emergence of the divide between, the kind of meta-narratives like Mahabharata and Ramayana taking over, like representing the entire South Asia, and little tradition coming from villages and kind of, small countryside. So that has also transformed into our musical tradition, into our literary tradition. So it will be somewhat derogatory if we kind of look from the post-colonial perspective and the decolonial perspective to use such kind of terms. We have to be more cautious. That is my first line of caution. But what I would like to say is that you have mentioned about the influence of Dylan on the music of Northeast, and which is well said. But how does it kind of resonate with Bengali song or Bānglā-gān, although they are in the same genre of folk music and the music of resistance, the music for kind of bringing about some kind of social justice? Because if you go to Shillong or if you go to Manipur, Nagaland, Mizoram in the Northeast, they would say that we have very little to do with Bengali music or Bengali culture or Bengali literature, because Bengali language is often seen as kind of colonizing the kind of people of Northeast, because there has been a long standing linguistic movement in Assam from the 1960s, and then it translated into other parts of Northeast. So you have to be again cautious in that sense, but definitely it is true and it's correct that Dylan has had a huge influence on the music that has been created in the Northeast. But then how do you bring it into your thesis? Because a kind of snowballing effect, in the sense that people may say that, well, how does it kind of matter for us, because it is about Bānglā-gān or this is one part of the kind of thing I would like you to reflect upon, be kind of critically more.
Yeah. So I have been looking. Yeah. Sorry. Sorry for interrupting. So I have been looking at ways to broaden out, because there are a lot of influences, not just Dylan. There are the Beatles. So like Bengalis have always been open to kind of looking at the global influences. Now here's the thing. So when Dylan won the Nobel Prize in Literature in 2016, the Western world was really not. They did not take it really positively. It was not taken very positively. It was most people, most academics, in fact, they thought of it as a farce. But Bengalis rather celebrated Dylan winning the Nobel Prize. And again, this has got to do with something that happened 100 years back, because Rabindranath Tagore was the first person, who won the Nobel Prize in Literature for a book of poems or songs, as we can say, Gitanjali. So this is again something that has remained rooted in the Bengali cultural consciousness. So, like in Kabir Suman's music, we find this sort of connected lineage of influences, like from Lalan Fakir in the 19th century to Rabindranath Tagore in the 19th and 20th century. In the 18th century, in the 18th and 19th century, Tagore, and in the 20th century, of course, Dylan. So again, I think this has got to do with the impact of cultural globalization, because with cultural globalization, there are no alien cultures and there is no foreign culture. So it's always basically what we now see is local, with global and the local interacting with one another, which is again an important argument for my thesis. But of course, I want to use all of these Anglo-American influences to look at how Indian music itself has transformed. And I'm not just limiting my PhD research to Bānglā-gān. For the purpose of this topic, I just wanted to kind of share and talk about, adaptations, translations, and how Dylan has been represented within Bānglā-gān, how his songs have been translated, etc. But there is again in Kolkata a rich heritage of English music, like Indo-English music. There is a rich heritage in Kolkata, and that again is something that has sort of gone under the radar. It's not really well represented. So again, it's not just about Dylan, of course, because Dylan appears among an assembly of influences. But then, why I use the term Dylan consciousness in the context of this paper or in the context of my research previously is because Dylan has always been used as the sort of label or the marker. Anyone who tries, any musician who tries to do something creative, tries to bring in influences from other places, is always compared with Dylan first and first, not the Beatles, not Freddie Mercury from Queen, always Dylan. And I think that has got to do with the lyrical sort of thing that Dylan's music, has. Because frankly speaking, again, most people who have listened to Dylan or drawn in influences from Dylan, they don't really connect to his notion of musicality or his, what in Bengali we call shul. It's more about the lyrics. It's more about the lyrics and the beats, and how he presents the music. It's a sort of a combined performance. And to answer your first question, even I don't prefer the term folk. So again, there's been this long-standing debate between academics. My supervisor Richard Williams also addressed this in his talk last week. So again, there are terms like folk music, then there's popular music, then there's Bengalis prefer to call it Lok-giti sometimes, you know. But I think in the context of Bānglā-gān, the preferable term should be people's music. Again, this is something that I hypothesize because folk music, by definition, and this has been mentioned by Ashok Ranade, musicologist, he says that folk music is something that doesn't come with a date or a label. You are not supposed to know who the creator is. It's timeless. It's a timeless cultural piece. That's folk music. But then again, if you look at Bāul-gān, Bāul-gān has references to Lalun Fakir. Bāul-gān, everyone knows the person who's writing the song, and it's not really in that context. You cannot call it timeless. So if you cannot call it timeless, how can you label it as folk music? So that has to do something with people's music, even with Kobi Shuman's songs, or even with Mohiনের Ghoraguli songs. Maybe you can call them political songs. Maybe you can call them people's music. I mean, it's up to debate. So, yeah.
Thank you. Deb, do you want to add to the dialogue there?
Yes, I think I completely agree with using a kind of term which is more politically sensitive. And as you have used kind of terms, or maybe song assistance, like, because a lot of the work that has been done in South Asia by organizations like IPTA and other kind of, you might know the work of Sumangla. She works at Ashoka University, and they are kind of doing world music with South African kind of music and Indian music combined. So I think, yeah, you have to be innovative in terms of using a particular term or lexicon which kind of addresses the ideas and the aspirations of marginalized communities. Because I think the Bāul song is also representative of the wider kind of landscape. Sorry, it is not only talking about humans, but humans' interaction with the more than human spaces, and that is, I think, the grasp of the significance of Bāul music. So I think, yeah, I completely agree that what you have said. But you have to be a little sensitive about the context of when you're talking about the Northeast and other places. Because I know you are aware of all these kind of complexities, but when we narrow it down to Bānglā-gān, it may not be kind of very much suitable for other communities who see kind of Bengali as a hegemonic kind of language. So in that context, I think I'll stop here. Thank you for the time.
That's a very interesting point to make. Any other questions? Okay. Well, you mentioned sort of broadening away from not just sort of Dylan's influences. You mentioned the Beatles. I mean, would you sort of bring in the jazz musicians in the 50s and 40s who worked with other subcontinental musicians, people like John Coltrane, who used the drone and tabla and jazz records in the 50s? Certainly influenced by Indian subcontinent, anyway.
Yeah. So there are one of the first Western musical genres that came to India, basically, that was imported, might be the more accurate term here, was jazz. of course, in the 1940s and 50s, especially in the hotels in Kolkata, you would see jazz musicians like Teddy Weatherford. I'm forgetting the name, something Butler. So there were a lot of African American musicians who came to India and who used to play in those hotels, in Kolkata, and that's how this live music, vibrant live music culture started. That was sort of was created during in colonial times. This was not even after independence, not in a post-colonial sense, and that's when Kolkata started becoming sort of the urban epicenter, kind of for cultural globalization. And then again, Kolkata was also the gateway to Nepal. It was the gateway to Nepal, and Nepal was again a destination that was that the hippie trail that went to Nepal, sort of, you know. And then again, from Kolkata, another Bengali musician, but then again, it is in the area of classical music. It's Pandit Ravi Shankar, who interacted with the Beatles. He interacted with George Harrison of the Beatles. So there are also other encounters and sort of intersections, in this regard. Then there's Cliff Richards, who came to India in the 80s and met with Mother Teresa. So I'm still researching a lot on them, but yes, I'm sure that there are many more sort of musicians and musical genres that have found representation in Calcutta.
Yeah, no, in the context of PhD, you might want to narrow down, but I guess otherwise there's too many things to cover. But one of your slides was the interesting ones about you distinguish between sort of Shilpi artists and sort of more purist or traditional in sort of Bāul music. I think one of the famous, you distinguish between sort of traditional and sort of purist forms of Bāul music, or in Bānglā-gān. I think Dylan himself is sort of one of the most famous things about him is that he went from very much the folk tradition of the 30s to it and popularized it and went electric. And there's a whole stream of followers, as it were, who regard it as a traitorous act.
Oh yeah, I think.
So, what's your view on purity versus progress?
Yeah, so Bāul music, in terms of Bāul music, that's to answer one part of your question. I think in Bāul music you will see that so the Bāuls were a very tightly packed, very small group of people who had certain rules and principles and their certain way of life up until a certain point of time. But now you will see even normal people, like they are not Bāuls, they don't live that way of life, they don't do the Deho Sadhana and the Bāul Sadhana and all of those practices. They are not Bāuls by religious practice or in other ways, but they dress up in the Bāul garb and perform, so they are like cosmopolitan performers. And so I think again Bāul fusion or any fusion variants of Bāul or any interactions of Bāul with the Anglo-American musical systems or styles again was brought in by Purna Bāul himself, because Purna Bāul interacted with Dylan. He performed in America and in other places in the West, and then he was the one who sort of brought in more and more experimental trends into Bāul music, and that is why we nowadays see sort of radical Bāul music variants like Bāul rock music. And to answer your second question, yes, I think this is again one of the reasons why Dylan connects so well with Bengali questions of Bengali culturalism and Bengali music. I think is because Dylan has always, you cannot categorize, it's not possible to categorize Bob Dylan. He started out as a folk musician, from Greenwich, and he was labeled rather a protest musician. And then he, in 1965 Newport, as many will recall here, he went electric. And Pete Seeger, the American musician who I mentioned in my slides, who was again a great friend of Kobi Shumon and came to India. He was rumored to have cut the cords, in the middle of the concert because he was so annoyed that Dylan went electric. So again, this purist versus experimentalist thing is there across cultures. Even in Kolkata nowadays, you will see classical musicians looking down upon popular musicians, and popular musicians always criticizing. So this divide is always there.
Oh, thank you. I think Deb's still got his hand up, but I think Tanzil had it up earlier. Tanzil, unmute the speaker?
Yeah, hi. Thank you. I mean, that was an excellent presentation. I'm going to take the conversation a bit to the larger philosophical foundation or the framework. So this notion of the global, I was wondering, I mean, which variant were you really exploring? Because I mean, there is one, the notion of global in, in relation to Latin American scholars, with the relations of transmodernity, but also I was interested, like this notion of locality, because it, to move beyond this geographical notion of movement across, but it's also the notion of locality in time. And I say that with reference to a lot of literature that talk about, Dylan's influence, or, kind of like the relationship with Rumi, with Maulana Rumi's work, and then with Dylan. So in that temporal globalization, that's one part. But did you find, the notion of hybridity from Homi Bhabha? Like, how does it intersect with the global? I mean, do you see a reflection of global in Bhabha's notion of hybrid? If that makes sense, if the question makes sense.
Yeah, of course it does. I mean, it's overtly theoretical and very, sort of academic, but yeah, it does make sense. So there are many terms which they are very closely interrelated, and I have been going through them recently. There's this term melange, then there's this term hybridization, then there's cross-cultural intersection something, and then there's globalization. So to answer your first question, the spatial and the temporal both. So for the temporal, I'd like to talk about Mohiner Ghodaguli, this band who sort of started this experiment. So Mohiner Ghodaguli at the time when they were performing, they came to fame. They were drawing in Western influences, but also maintaining their local heritage, sort of creating local music in a sense. They were not appreciated and they did not attract the crowds or the audiences during that time. But rather, if you move ahead to the 90s, 2000s, and our generations, we celebrate and treat Mohiner Ghodaguli basically as Bengali musical heritage. So this, I think, is again an example of the temporal aspect of the concept of globalization. Because so Dylan, in my sense, I would argue that Dylan has this temporal and spatial, both of these globalizations, because one, Dylan has influenced music cultures across the world, not just in India, not just in Bangladesh, not just in South Asia. So that there's this, the approach is, the outreach is global when it comes to Dylan. And it's also temporal because, like, I shared this, again, I apologize for not being able to play the sounds. Otherwise, it would have been a more, enjoyable presentation, I'm sure. So there was this album in 2013, this creative sort of album, a tribute to Bob Dylan. So basically, that has music that was created by Dylan in the early 60s and 70s. But that album was being adapted, the music was being adapted and released in 2013. So again, it's not a very, I mean, it's not a linear sort of a equation. It's a sort of a rhizomatic flux. You cannot say which way the direction will take. And about hybridity, I think hybridity is, I mean, I've been reading Bhabha's hybridity, especially last week I went through it, but I think the concept of globalization is more appropriate when it comes to popular music culture in India, because I mean, if you say that this is a musical hybrid, for instance, if you say Baul rock is hybrid music, but then how do you define? I mean, what's the rate of hybridity? How much is the global and how much is the local in the global? It cannot be quantified like that. So I think globalization is the concept that appeals more when it comes to
absolutely. Yeah, I mean, I feel like there is a critique of hybridity in that, because hybridity assumes two distinct identities prior to the hybridization, and and kind of like, I feel like that you're getting towards that it's not like a specific identity that's already established. So globalization, it's more, as a theoretical framework, it's more able to handle all those anomalies and rhizomatic conditions. So yeah, I mean, thank you. Thanks, Niaz, for
Thank
taking
you.
the question.
Thank you very much.
Thanks, Council. I mean, I guess to either of you, I mean, do you see those trends, sort of global and local trends? Will they make this type of music, or just world music generally, more complex or more bland? What do you foresee for the next 60 years?
Okay, so can I? Yeah. So I think the concept of globalization is just a theoretical framework, in my opinion. I mean, it's quite clear what I'm trying to mean, or what the concept of globalization in popular culture essentially means. So I have used the concept taking Habibul Haq Khondkar. He's a Bangladeshi scholar. This was his paper where he quantified, sort of in a sense, interrelated the concept of globalization in popular music, in food, in popular culture and everything. But in my opinion, it's just a theoretical concept. I mean, you just use it to, I mean, denote something that cannot be denoted in any other sense. I mean, so it's the global and the local, and they combine to make the global. But I think what's more, I mean, what musicologists should do more is look at the micro histories. I recently came in contact with a musician who was essentially the first musician from Kolkata to sing, I mean, music in English, original music in English, not covers or tribute songs or adaptations, original music in English from Calcutta. So, I mean, that those are the sort of stories that we should, I mean, in my opinion, humble opinion, we should focus on. Yeah, theoretical
Yes.
frameworks, they are just there.
No, that makes sense to me. No, thank you very much, Arka. If there's any other hands, please put them up. But I think we've probably run the course, and I think the sooner we finish.
Another question.
There is another. You got another.
No, Deb must ask a question.
Yeah, I just wanted to add.
Sorry, Deb, I didn't see your hand go up.
Oh, no, that's fine. I just wanted to add something like when we were talking about hybridity and the problems with hybridity, there is also this concept of third space, which Baba and Linton kind of comes up with. So perhaps you can also look into that. Also, although it talks in terms of cultural space and kind of physical space and kind of borderlands, but even within the field of music, you can look into that kind of creation of a third space. With the emergence of these musical transformation by bringing in the influences from both worlds. So that's just a kind of, it's not a question, it's just a kind of suggestion. Thank you.
Yeah, I tried, actually, I'll be really brutally honest because now the session's almost over. I mean, I tried reading Bhava. It's incredibly complicated. That's like the one thing I have to say. It takes a lot of time to digest and understand because hybridity I just read last week and it took me 1 week to process it. So yeah, I'll try that. Yeah, third space. I'll remember that. Thanks, Dr. Das.
No, thank you, Deb, and thank you everyone who's contributed. And yes, the more, if we finish it now, we'll have more time to follow up your links and listen to them later. But thank you all for...
Again, I'm incredibly sorry. There's something wrong with my laptop. Okay.
No, I think everyone who uses Zoom knows these difficulties. Everyone's learned in the last 2 years. So thank you for taking time out from your research to share findings so far. It's really much appreciated.
Thank you. Thank you, Dr. Alam. Thank you, Dr. Ahmedullah.